La Semana de la Seguridad Telefónica, presentada por Aslo Information Technologies, 19 y 20 de octubre 2021.
So here comes the third conversation in the telephony security of with Aslo. And I am so glad that I am with Jim Dalton, Chief Executive Officer of Transnexus. I'm going to read his bio. And Jim Dalton began his telecom career at Bell South in 1988 in roles that included financial analysis and market planning for their GSM wireless and mobile data businesses. Recognizing the promise of the voice over IP, Jim founded Transnexus in 1997 to develop software solutions for VoIP IP carriers. Over the following years, Transnexus has developed applications for least cost routing, billing support, quality of service monitoring, analytics, and prevention of telecom fraud and of wanted robocalls. During this time, Transnexus was obtained 27 patents for various software innovations. Recent innovations include the development of software that uses the shaken stirred framework to authenticate, sign, and validate caller ID information for prevention of unwanted robocalls, which often use caller ID spoofing to lure subscribers into answering robocalls. Thank you so much, Jim, for being with us. And please tell us what you have in mind for us today.
Okay, Elena, thank you. And it's nice to be here and to share information about what we're doing in North America that, I think it applies to every telephone user around the world. And, what has been a problem in the U.S. for years, and, we'll talk about this in the presentation, but for years, criminals have been stealing from, normal people who have no idea that they are fooled into, a crime where, their identity gets stolen, their bank account gets stolen, real money gets stolen from innocent victims. And now, personally, this happened to my father. He was called by somebody and he gave his social security number. That's his tax number. Had no idea. He was elderly, didn't realize what he was doing, and he got robbed big time. And there's no place to go. You can call the police and there's nothing they can do for you. And it's it's annoying telephone calls. That's part of the problem. But really the theft it's billions of dollars in the U.S. And it's around the world. We hear this from customers all around the world. We serve customers globally. And there are just an awful lot of criminals out there. And the telephone network is a really great way to steal because it gives you, you can touch your victim, and be completely anonymous. And it's very effective. Criminals know how to do that. And what really makes the telephone network so good for stealing is it's so easy to be an imposter. You can use the telephone number of the tax authorities. You call somebody up and say, this is the tax authority calling. They see the telephone number. They go, oh my gosh, this is the tax man. I'm in trouble. And they can just, steal your identity or whatever. So that's the problem. And I'm sure everybody understands that who has a telephone. You get these annoying phone calls. And in the U.S., it's been an effort for a long time that's finally coming to happen, a technology solution to restore trust to telephone calls. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal for users, and it's important for service providers. And so that's what we'll be talking about, sharing with you, what we've lived through in Canada and the U.S. is they're both really the same implementation. And I think there will be some lessons that can be learned by other countries, to see, what has happened in North America. It's not the only way to do it, but it's good to see examples of what has been put in place. So, Elena, I'll stop there. Thanks for asking, but that's what I wanted to discuss today.
That's great, and we're going to just say that everything that Jim is going to talk about right now is applies to the U.S. and Canada. If you need some translation, Facebook and YouTube can put it for you, as you can put the closed caption option, so you can listen or translate. And if there is any question in Spanish, I'll translate it to Jim, so you can both communicate. So Jim is all your audience, and the please continue.
Okay. All right, Elena. So thank you. So, the title I have here, it's all about understanding stir and shaken. You may have heard these terms, you may not have. And, if you don't know anything about stir or shaken, that's okay. This presentation is for you to understand the basics. And so let me get started. And, these terms, stir and shaken, what do they mean? In telecom, there are always so many acronyms, and STIR stands for Secure Telephony Identification Revisited. I don't make these names up, but that's what that's what the engineers that developed this technology, that's what they call it. And it's a standard. It's a technology standard. And I want to mention that because sometimes there's a confusion between stir and shaken. Stir is a standard, a technology standard that's developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. And the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, they define all the technology standards for the Internet. And, secure telephony identification is one of those standards and applies worldwide, not unique to North America. But a problem with, and let me just, before I move on, let me just mention what this STIR identification is. And I'm going to be talking about this in other parts. It's about how you create a digital signature that you add to a telephone call so you can trust that telephone number. Literally, the originating telephone service provider is going to add a digital signature to the telephone number. So when it gets to the far end, you can see, Telmex, signed this call. They put their digital signature on this call. I can trust it. That's the model in the US. If you trust the carrier it came from, and you don't need to know the carrier, there's some technology that goes on in the background that people don't have anything to do with this. This is all really at the service provider, the carrier level, then you can trust that telephone call. So move on to shaken. So we've talked about STIR is the technology standard that defines this digital signature for a telephone call. What is shaken? Shaken is a little bit different. It's, signature based, has a digital signature, and it's asserted information. And that word asserted is important because the originating telephone service provider, they are going to assert, this customer is who they say they are. Or there are some cases where you may want to have a different telephone number on purpose. So you're using the number that's not actually making the telephone call because that's the number you want people to recall back, the called party to return the call. So you can use the number that, whatever number a telephone subscriber wants to be used, a service provider can sign that number if they trust that customer, that they're using a number they can use, and they're ready. The service provider will put their digital signature on that telephone number. So that is what the assertion piece is. The telephone service provider who originates the call is asserting this telephone call, you can trust it, or maybe you can't trust it, whatever the assertion is. And they do that with a token. And I'll show you what a token is in a few more slides. But about shaken, what it is, it's not actually a technology standard. It's a framework. It takes the STIR technology and it defines how it should be implemented by telephone service providers in the US and Canada. Because, you know, you've got to make sure telephone calls always work. And interoperability only works if every carrier does everything in the signaling path exactly the same. And that's what the framework is. It defines how to use these digital signatures. There are different ways to do it. You eliminate all the options and you just define a framework. Every carrier is going to do it this way. So it'll work throughout the telephone network in Canada and the US. And that's what shaken is. It's a framework. So let me move on to give you a little bit of history, because I think it's important to understand, you know, this has been a long process to get to where we are in North America, in the US and Canada. And, you know, it really began in the US way back in 2012. The Federal Trade Commission, that's the group that protects consumers from, you know, getting, you know, from fraudulent criminals stealing from them in business transaction. They opened hearings on robocall complaints back in 2012. This has been a major issue, the #1 complaint at the Federal Trade Commission since 2012. So this problem, it's not new. It's been around for a long time. And in 2015, a group called ATIS began working on this shaken framework. And what ATIS is, it's basically a group of service providers, you know, in Canada, in the US, and vendors, includes Transnexus, who come together and define the framework. It's very much similar to the IETF. It's a collaborative process. Anybody can participate, anybody can contribute, and a consensus drives the final outcome. So the work began in 2015 to begin this shaken framework. And in 2016, you know, really nothing had been done to stop robocalls. A lot of talk, no action at the government level or by carriers. And in 2016, the Federal Communications Commission, they really coerced, they made the carriers create a robocall strike force to be, you know, to report to the Federal Communications Commission, how are you going to stop robocalls? The carriers did that. They created the robocall strike force. They generated a lot of reports. Really nothing happened to change the number of robocalls. By January of 2017, the shaken standard was developed after almost a year and a half. And again, nothing happened. No one implemented shaken until finally the US Congress, they passed a law. And they said every telephone carrier has to implement this shaken framework where you add a digital signature to every call so you can know whether to trust a call or not. The calling party will know if a call is trustworthy or not. So that was December 2019. Really nothing had happened, you know, in the 7 years since 2012 of, you know, to prevent robocalls. Congress passed the law, and it mandated that shaken had to be implemented in SIP networks by June of this year, 2021. Takes time to get these things done into networks. They gave telephone carriers a year and a half, and that's a law. If you have a SIP network, you have to implement shaken. But there's still a lot of non-SIP networks in North America. TDM, what we call, you know, non-SIP networks, TDM, or time division multiplexing networks. They cannot implement shaken. Shaken is a SIP technology for an IP network. So, but the law did require that the industry must develop a call authentication solution for non-SIP networks. And that's important because so much of the world has non-SIP telecommunications. And then last year, this year, June 2021, the big carriers in the U.S. with 100,000 subscribers or more, they deployed Shaken. And the smaller providers, they got an extension. They have more time, until 2023 to implement it. But the big carriers have implemented Shaken, and it is a reality now in the U.S. So that's the history. And I guess the important point I wanted you to understand, it's a long process to get the entire telecom industry to agree to do something. And it was really impossible in the U.S. It took a law, an act of Congress to make that happen. And so it's a slow process to change the telephone network. And, I think that's important for everyone outside of the U.S. and Canada to appreciate, to find a solution to really make telephone networks secure. It's a long process, and it's technically not difficult, but it only works if every carrier does it. And that's the challenge, to get that in place. So let me give you a few more important developments here. And in the U.S., this is actually last fall, the FCC, they required every carrier to implement a robocall mitigation plan and certify that plan with the FCC. Now, what does that mean, a robocall mitigation plan? Basically, the FCC said you have to police your network. If you're a telephone service provider, you need to take action. You need to monitor and analyze the calls that originate from your network. You need to make sure no robocalls originate on your network. And that's a new development. Before, it's been about blocking robocalls at the termination network, keeping them out of your network from the public telephone network. The FCC changed the model. You cannot let your network emit a robocall. And if your network is a source of robocalls, you will face enforcement action. And that's a new model, and that applies to the U.S. and it actually applies outside the U.S. And I'll get to that point in a minute. But so that was big. That point is service providers are now liable for robocalls if they originate on their network. It's a whole different business model and liability concern for carriers. They need to make sure their networks are not a source of robocalls. In May of this year, another new development. Originally Shaken was about telephone service providers that had telephone numbers that could issue and get telephone numbers. But there's a lot of companies out there that provide telephone service that use the telephone network. They're not telephone companies. But, for the end users, they sure feel like a telephone company. You make telephone calls from your service provider. And, what the FCC did is extend the Shaken framework. So anybody who provides telephone service to an end user, they don't need facilities. They don't need a wireless network. They don't need 1 inch of fiber or copper. It can all be done as a hosted internet voice service. You're now under the regulations. You have to implement Shaken, and you're included in these requirements. And that's a really important thing. That extends Shaken beyond telephone service providers to every application that can put a voice call on the telephone network. So that would be over-the-top voice over IP calls, would even be a click-to-call application on your PC, on your laptop, or on your computer. So more participation, expanding the reach of where Shaken it applies. And this July, another important development. ATIS, that's the group I'd mentioned earlier that defined the Shaken framework. At as required by the law, they developed standards for call authentication, actually standards for Shaken over TDM networks, over existing SS7 ISDN networks. You can now implement shaken. And that's important because now shaken can be this shaken trust, this call authentication can be across all networks, not just SIP, but existing telephony networks. And there's still so much of that in the world. And that's a really, it's a powerful extension because until you protect every bit of the network, you still leave a back door for the thieves to get in and steal. So this issue you may or may not be aware of, or rather this ruling, or in September of this year, U.S. providers are required to block calls from carriers that have not certified their robocall mitigation plan. And that applies to non-U.S. carriers as well. If you're a U.S. service provider and you send calls, if you're a non-U.S. service provider and you send calls to the U.S., then the gateway operator in the U.S. that accepts your traffic, they have to block your calls to the U.S. with a U.S. calling number, because that's where robocalls come from. Typically, it's an offshore call with a U.S. calling number that people are calling subscribers in the U.S. So in those cases, if the non-U.S. provider has not filed with the FCC that they have a robocall mitigation plan, then the U.S. provider is required to block those calls that have a U.S. calling number. And where this is really a problem, it's really a problem for U.S. wireless customers. They roam to Mexico, they try to make a call home, and if the wireless service provider in Mexico has not certified with the U.S., with the FCC that they have a robocall mitigation plan, then the U.S. provider that accepts that call from the Mexico carrier, they're required to block that call. Now, it's not a big loss, really. I mean, there's probably not that much traffic of wireless roamers going to Mexico, so it probably won't be a big impact for the non-U.S. carriers, but it's going to be an impact for U.S. subscribers who are roaming internationally, and they try to call home because they have a telephone call to the U.S. with a U.S. calling number. So that's going to be the impact, and something to be aware of if you're not aware of that already. So if you have any questions about this robocall mitigation plan, feel free to contact me. We've had a lot of experience working with foreign non-U.S. providers that want to implement that. They want to be in the FCC database. We can explain to you how to do it. It's really not a very difficult process once you understand what's going on, and we can help explain the details of what you need to do. And last point what I'll make here is in November next month, Canadian service providers have to implement shaken. It's a mandate. So it's going to be throughout the U.S. and Canada very soon. So those are just some important developments. I think they do impact, providers outside the U.S. to some extent, and I wanted to make you aware of that. But let's move on. How does shaken work? And it works. It's all about trust, and that's a big deal. To be able to trust communications. It's so important, and it relies on a central trust anchor. There's one entity that every service provider trusts, and I'm going to tell you more about that in the next slide. And every telephone service provider that joins the shaken trust network, who can put their digital signature on a telephone call, they're vetted. They're vetted twice, once by a policy administrator who makes sure that, they are a telephone company and, they meet the regulatory requirements, but also by a certificate authority. And I'm going to explain more about policy administrators and certificate authorities in the next slide. But both of those organizations have their vetting process to make sure that, it's not a bad actor, a criminal who's trying to join the shaken network. we're a certificate authority in the U.S., and we have very strict vetting processes. We look pretty deeply to understand, has this company or the officers, we search, for the names of the officers, have they ever been involved with a lawsuit related to some kind of telephone activity? And it's been an eye-opener for us. We've been surprised at the number of people. It may have been 10 years ago, but they were caught doing some kind of problem, related to the telephone network. And we don't sell them a certificate. We just don't want to work with those people. And that's the risk. If you're a troublemaker, nobody wants to work with you, because the damage you can cause to a reputation in a trust network, it's expensive. And it's just not worth it to take on those customers, and we don't. So the trust anchor enforces the rules, and I'll talk just a little bit more about how they do that. And it's easy to get rid of, a bad actor. And I'll elaborate on the next slide a little bit about how certificates work. But the key point here is it's based on this digital technology. You have a digital signature and you have a certificate. And if you revoke a service provider's certificate, they're out. It's that simple. So you push a button, you revoke their certificate, you put them on the bad list. Everybody knows all their all their digital signatures are now invalid. It's a very serious enforcement action that, frankly, it'll put a carrier out of business immediately. And, it's not going to be used lightly, but, when it's used, it will be effective, that kind of enforcement action. So, I've mentioned it uses, digital signatures. The term we use for that is it's cryptography, and it's conventional cryptography. The security on the internet is what is being used on Shaken. This technology is 20 years older. It's not new. There's no new security technology developed here. What has worked on the world of the internet is being applied to telephone calls. And again, it's all about the carrier. They put a digital signature on their telephone call in the signaling, and they have a public certificate. Public. Anybody can see it. It's not private. Anybody can get that public certificate, because if they see a digital signature, they can verify it with that carrier's public certificate. And that is really as simple. It's as simple as that. And it's very effective and very scalable in terms of, implementing into a huge network. So this is what I want to describe to you, this Shaken Trust Network. And this is the way it's defined by Addis. And, it could be defined in a different way in a private Shaken network, or, in a country, a regulatory authorities in a different country may have a little bit different model, but the technology is really the same. And in the U.S., it begins, and also Canada, it begins with the governance authority. And that's a group, in both Canada and the U.S., a group of telephone service providers. Big ones, little ones, wireless carriers, fiber operators, a selective group of telephone carriers that represent, the entire industry to make policies. And for sure, there's some guidance from regulators on what those policies need to be. But the industry really develops the policies in this governance authority. And the governance authority transmits those policies to the policy administrator. The policy administrator is a real operation. They have people answer the phones, they check things, and they do the vetting to determine, who can be part of the Shaken Trust Network. And it begins with certificate authorities. Now, you may be familiar with certificate authorities. They issue certificates for, SSL certificates, all kinds of certificates we use in the internet. Well, it's exactly the same technology for Shaken, except you cannot use those web certificates. It's a different certificate. It's a shaken certificate. It's identical in every way, except it has a parameter. It says this can only be used for shaken. You can't use it for code signing. You can't use it for SSL certificates. It can only be used for shaken certificates. So it's designed to be limited just to telephone calls. And so certificate authorities have to apply to the policy administrator. The policy administrator has their policies. If you want to be a shaken certificate, you have to do these things. And it's a 50-page document. And you have to certify, we do these things, and here's how we do these things. And if you're accepted, then you get approval to issue shaken certificates. And I think in the U.S., there's 6 different shaken certificates. These are companies that will issue shaken certificates to telephone companies. So that's the first step. You can't create a digital signature unless you have a certificate. So you need a certificate authority to issue a certificate to a service provider. So that's the first step in the policy administrator. You vet and approve certificate authorities. And then you vet and approve telephone service providers. Is it really a telephone company? Have they have the regulatory requirements in place? If they do, they're allowed to join the network, and they get a code, a special code just for that service provider. And it's digitally signed by the policy administrator. And it's called a service provider code or service provider code token. In the ADIS framework. And that code is needed to get a certificate, because service providers, they need a certificate to sign their calls, but they can only get certificates from approved certificate authorities. So they submit their service provider code to the certificate authority. The certificate authority, they validate that it's valid because it's been digitally signed by the policy administrator. And they'll realize, okay, this service provider, they did get a code. They have been authorized by the policy administrator, and they provide a certificate back to the telephone service provider. And now the telephone service provider can digitally sign their calls, and they will be trusted by every other service provider in this shaken trust network. So there's a lot there, and but that's everything really of how this framework works. And I think you will probably see outside of North America, maybe these, especially in private networks, these functions of the governance authority, the certificate authority, the policy administrator, perhaps collapsed into one box, and that would make complete sense. All the functionality would be there. In a private network, it would be easier to implement because, well, it's a private. It's not public. It doesn't have to include every service provider. But I wanted you to understand kind of the full details of how it works based on the shaken standard. So let's talk a little bit about, the call flow and what I've got here. So we've talked about the trust infrastructure. And I want to explain to you, how does that infrastructure get used in telephone signaling? So there's a simple diagram here. We've got 2 service providers. One is originating telephone calls. One is terminating telephone calls. And in these green boxes, this is the shaken function. It's just software. Part of it is to authenticate a call. The originating service provider is going to authenticate a telephone number and, put their digital signature. This is a good telephone number. You can trust it. That's the authentication mechanism. And then on the termination side, you have this verification software. When you receive a call with the digital signature, you go through the process to verify it and make sure that you can trust that number. So the call flow is like this. Call comes to the originating switch, and the switch talks to this shaken module, software module, to authenticate the call, to create this digital signature. And there'll be a lot of policies. You can have a lot of policies in this authentication module of who should get, different attestation values. But basically, this digital signature is created, and it's passed back to the switch in what we'll call a token. And we'll look at that in the next slide. And that token is included in the SIP invite to the destination network. So what is this token? It's pretty simple. Here is the token. And if you're familiar with these things, and in internet, it's really just a JSON token. And the header here, you can see it's a passport. That's a token used for all kinds of things. That's just a definition of what this kind of data structure is. It's a passport. And this type of passport is shaken, can only be used for shaken. And the important things I want to show here are the attestation values. And that's what this first item in the payload is, the attestation. It can be A, B, or C. And A means the service provider, they're saying this calling number you can trust. That telephone is authorized to use that telephone number, and I'm giving it an A attestation. So in a wireless network where, the calling number for a wireless phone, it's set in the switch. In a hosted PBX service, the calling number is defined in the hosted PBX service. The subscriber can't play with the number. So that is a very good telephone number. That is a secure number because the carrier has assigned it in the signaling at the switch. It gets an attestation of A. Now there's a next case, where maybe as a provider, you have SIP trunks to an enterprise. The enterprise has a telephone system. They have a SIP trunk to the provider. And maybe the service provider gives the enterprise 100 telephone numbers. And when a telephone call is made from that enterprise telephone system, you don't know really which telephone number should be assigned to that call because the enterprise could play with those calling numbers. And that's a case where you can trust the trunk group, but you cannot be positive about the calling number. So the classic example is, an inside criminal, they spoof the number of the CEO and they call the bank and tell their bank, transfer funds to this account. They see it's the CEO it's calling, but it's not. It's an insider criminal that has spoofed that calling number and to, authorize an invalid wire transfer example. That's a case where it's really, you just can't trust the number. You can trust the trunk. We know that is a call from an individual enterprise, but we cannot be certain about that specific calling number. So that's a case where you would give an attestation of B. And then there's the lowest level, if you're a wholesale provider, you have no idea where the call is coming from, who originated the call. That's an attestation C. It doesn't mean it's a bad telephone call. It just means that whoever created this digital signature doesn't have any information about the calling number. So that's the attestation piece of the shaken passport or token. And I want to point out, here's an interesting item that's included is this origination ID. The origination service provider, they can put an opaque identifier in every passport, in every token. So they know exactly which call that was. And so it's very important. You can use that how you like. It can be by telephone number. It could be even randomized. It's you've got the flexibility as a service provider to use that origination ID, but it links that token, that passport to a specific call event in the originating service provider's network. So when the token is decoded at the far end at the destination network, they can cite that origination ID, and the originating service provider will know exactly which call that was. The last item I want to identify here is the certificate repository. That's where the digital certificate for this token is stored. It's on the public internet. Anybody can get it. It's public. And when a call goes to the destination network, it will grab it'll decode this token. It'll see this certificate repository. It'll get the certificate, the public certificate for this token, and use it to verify the call. And that really ensures the terminating provider, this certificate I trust, and I can use it to validate the signature. So therefore I can trust this calling number. So anyway, a lot there, but let's go back to, in a simple terms, it's just as simple as validating a signature, digital signature with a digital certificate. So back to our call flow, we can see here on the origination side, we added this token and it has the digital signature. It's sent across the network to the destination network, the terminating carrier. And that terminating carrier is going to send that token to its verification module to verify. And that's first step. It's going to get the certificate and use that certificate to verify the digital signature in the token. And let me point out something, some folks worry, gosh, if I have to go get a certificate every call, is that going to add post-dial delay? You don't have to get a certificate on every call. Certificates are usually good for a week, a month, a year. Once you get a certificate, you're going to cache it. So for the next call, you would not get the certificate again. You'd already have it here locally. So really the post-dial delay impact, it's not noticeable. So the call gets verified. The public certificate's retrieved to validate the token, the digital signature of the token. And the verifications returns the verification status to the switch, which could be this call is not verified, block it, or it's verified, you want to indicate to the call-ed party, with a check mark or with a V, it's verified, something to indicate to the called party, you can trust this telephone call. And that is really an end-to-end flow of how Shaken works within a network. So I'm going to move on and kind of address one important issue that's prevented, the full potential of Shaken. This works with SIP. You've got to send that token across a SIP network with a SIP invite. There's a lot of the world that does not have SIP end-to-end. And that's where this solution that came up this summer, actually there are two different solutions for how to implement Shaken for a TDM network. And the most, the standard that's going to be used, which is being used most widely now and is the best technique, is something called out-of-band Shaken. And what I mean by out-of-band, in that previous slide, we saw the token was passed in-band in the invite. But if you have a non-SIP network, you cannot pass the token through the network. So you pass it out of band. And how does that work? Starts off the same way. A call comes to a soft switch. It goes to the Shaken authentication software that's going to create the digital signature. And it returns the digital signature, just as in the previous diagram, to the switch that sends it to the destination network. But it also sends it to a call placement service. It posts that token, that digitally signed token, out of band over the internet to a call placement service server. And it's, it's a simple web server, really. And there's a lot of cryptography that goes on. This is very secure. And I won't get into those details, but this is a highly secure application, even though it's on the public internet. And on the destination side, here the call comes in. There's no token because it could not be passed through the network. But the software, the switch at the destination side, it still sends a message to the verification software. Can you verify this call? There's no token for you to verify. So the Shaken verification module gets the token from the call placement server. And now that passport, whether it comes in band or out of band, it's the same. It's the same verification process. And the call will be verified and then completed. And this is big because it really enables Shaken for every network, whether, it's a public network, private network, SIP, TDM. It makes shaken available everywhere. So that's shaken for TDM using the out of band technique. So let me move on and talk a little bit about the future of shaken. And, we're at the very beginning of just adding these signatures to a telephone call. And that's the foundation, the trust. But there's much more that's enabled by shaken. It's more than just robocall control. It definitely will do that, but it's more than that. And it's all about this trust that we've talked about. That's a big competitive advantage over really all the other communication mediums out there. There's so many ways to communicate with people. You've got WhatsApp, you've got email, you've got, every kind of voice over IP application you can think of. None of those are secure. There is, if you don't recognize the voice on the other end, and it's easy to spoof voices now with AI, artificial intelligence, you can't be sure who called you. It could be anybody pretending to be a criminal. And only the telephone network with shaken, with this trust authority, gives you that trust. And this is an advantage for telephone service providers. Everybody in the world has been trying to take voice communication from telephone companies, and they're succeeding. But this is one thing they cannot do because they don't have the trust, the ubiquitous trust across all networks that shaken is enabled. And that's really a big deal. That's a game changer for the telecom network. It's now uniquely different from every other kind of communication. Also for enterprises, banks in particular, we call a bank and they ask us all these questions. What's your dog's name? What about your wife? This, that, and the other. They have a long authentication process. But if you can trust the telephone number, this telephone number, it does belong to this person who they say they are. That this account does have this telephone number. And I can trust this telephone number because it was signed by, pick your carrier, AT&T, Telmex, whoever you want it to be. That is a very powerful tool in the simple task of just authenticating end users that call into your business. And so there's a direct benefit, just for enterprises and for end users, because this whole authentication process is a must for every, consumer to business transaction over the telephone. And that's I think end users are going to really like that. But it kind of goes beyond just telephone calls. Now service providers, they're not just providing telephone service, they're providing identity management. Today you got to have a phone to do so many things, but with shaken, you need it not just for communications, but to securely identify who you are, because your service provider is going to put that digital passport in there for you. And they have vetted their subscribers. They have a real billing relationship with those subscribers. It's a very, very powerful form of identity management, secure identity management for enterprises and people. And there really is nothing like it today. And that enables a lot of different new applications that I think we're going to see innovators start to implement. And the big one that enterprises are really excited about, hope it happens. It's not here yet, but it's coming. It's called branded calling. And it uses what's called rich call data. And rich call data, it's pretty simple. It takes that passport we looked at. That passport had the calling number, attestation, the origination ID, a few information elements. But you can add other information elements, such as the name of the caller, the logo of the caller, if it's an enterprise, a picture of a person, if it's an individual, if you want to transmit the picture, your photo, the reason for your call. When you have that kind of information show up on the display, the called party, they know who is calling and why they're calling, they're much, much more likely to answer that telephone call. And that's so important for enterprises. If they've got important information they need to share with their customers. They need to pick up their subscription. Their medical test results are back. There's been somebody, hacking your account, whatever. Important information that does not get conveyed by telephone now because subscribers don't answer the phone. Rich call data and the branding that can be enabled by it is a big value for enterprises that they'll pay for and for consumers. And it's not here yet, but we see it's just beginning. And let's look at some examples. Here's a couple examples. The one on the left, you see there, that's straight off of T-Mobile's website. T-Mobile is, from Deutsche Telekom originally. It's the third largest wireless provider in the U.S., the most innovative. And they were first out to implement Shaken way ahead of the deadline. And they are already beginning the process to implement Shaken, rich call data in their Shaken passports. And you can see the examples. Here's the T-Mobile logo. Here's the name of who is calling. They could add a reason for the call. There's not one in this display, but there's an example. Here's another one off a public website of what they're advertising in their rich call data. But this is a really great feature, and there will probably be more that innovators develop because now they've got this cryptographic trust infrastructure related to a telephone number and to a telephone call. So let me move on just a little bit about Shaken outside of North America. What should you expect? So I've told you what we have been doing in North America, or Canada and the U.S. for a long time, and it's taken a long time, but it's finally happening. What should you expect outside the Canada and the U.S.? I think it's going to be slow, just because from our experience, it's slow. You really, the public Shaken trust network, it's great, but it takes a lot to make everybody do it. The regulator has to, a lot of work to do to get the consensus in place. And that just takes time. And, but if it can happen, it's really a public good. A lot of value can be created. But, there's no need really to wait years for that to happen, because we're starting to see already private Shaken networks emerge. And it's possible a private Shaken network could grow to be, cover an entire country, all callers. I guess that's possible. And maybe what we'll see is several private Shaken networks develop and maybe they merge. I don't know how, the market will develop, but the technology is there. And I think we're already seeing innovators and entrepreneurs putting together private Shaken networks. And really in the U.S., and I think it's going to be this way everywhere, it's really the financial institutions who are the first movers. Because
yes, exactly. Talking about financial institutions, we got a lot of questions from our audience. Do you think it's good if we mention, or do you need to finish something?
Elena, I am here for you. I can continue. Okay. I can continue, or I can answer a question.
That's what I wanted to bring Astrid Archundia's comments. Jim, for bank and retails in other countries, what are the options for them if local telecoms providers are not doing this in our countries? Maybe she's speaking for Mexico, for Mexicans.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would feel frustrated, if I was one of those telephone subscribers that I'm left out of what is a technology that's been implemented in the internet for 2 decades for secure commerce over the internet, but we don't have it in the telephone network. And so, you need to encourage your regulators, but For enterprises, I think private shaken networks are possible, and the enterprises can extend their trust network to their customers. Mm-hmm. And we'll look at that in just the next slide. Actually, I think we're there. And if Elena, interrupt me if I want to go, I'll carry on with the conversation. Unless, did you have a question you wanted me to finish before I move on?
Well, we have three more.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
Paulina de la Torre is asking, Jim, if a company from a different country wants to participate in steer shaking to try to fix fraud in banks, can they do it?
So, yeah, good question. Shaken, as it's defined, what I've described, only applies to telephone numbers in the U.S. and Canada. But that's in this public regulated framework. In a private shaken network, you can do whatever you want. And so, in terms of we have seen this case being discussed. And the case I'm going to talk about is enterprises outside of America. They want to sign their calls that they send to the U.S. So with a shaken passport. And here's the case: it's a UK enterprise. Mm-hmm. It might be a UK bank, come to think of it, but it's they have they're headquartered in the UK. They have a lot of U.S. branches, and they want to make a telephone call from the UK, from a UK calling number, and they want it to have an A attestation when they call anyone in the US. And the way that is accomplished is a couple of different ways. You could get your US service provider takes that call if they serve that bank in the UK. Will you sign our calls with a UK telephone number? You could have that special relationship, and they could add that attestation. Or if it's a UK telephone service provider, they can have a subsidiary in the US, mm-hmm. and they could sign those calls using their US subsidiary. So I think I've given kind of a convoluted answer to your question. For calls in and out of Canada and the US, you can kind of use the existing shaken infrastructure by becoming part of it. Outside the US, I think it's really there's not a public option. It'll be more of a private initiative.
Yes, another question from Akoyani Diaz. She says, what happens with contact centers that operate from other countries such as Central America, and they call a lot of people in the US to sell services on behalf of American companies? Will their calls get blocked?
They might.
Yes.
Yes, they might. And they will, the way to make sure they do not get blocked is to file a robocall mitigation plan with the Federal Communications Commission. There are hundreds of international service providers who have filed their robocall mitigation plan. These, non-U.S. companies who send traffic to the U.S. They have implemented a robocall mitigation plan, and they have filed their plan with the FCC. And now, when they make a call to the U.S. provider will check and see, okay, this company, this contact center, they have filed a robocall mitigation plan. I can let their calls pass.
And the last one.
Yes.
The last question is, Jim, is shaken similar to SIP over TLS? And do you think a robocall mitigation plan might be applied in LATAM soon?
So shaken has no relationship to SIP over TLS. They're just two completely different mm-hmm. technologies. And ask the second question again, please.
Do you think robocall mitigation plan might be applied in Latin America soon?
So the robocall mitigation plan I have described is a FCC invention.
Yes.
I mean, it only applies to calls that the Federal Communications Commission has jurisdiction over. So, yeah, I think around the world, networks are implementing robocall mitigation to protect their subscribers from inbound robocalls. They're the terminating networks trying to keep robocalls out. I don't know if there's anybody outside the U.S. or outside the FCC regulation that's trying to keep robocalls from leaving their network. But
we can get inspired by that. I don't know. Maybe what you are doing with Aslo. Can you describe us what you've been working together in order to probably not get all the regulation in Mexico, but to try to stop this in other way?
Yeah, so absolutely. And, so we've worked with Aslo for years and, they're focused on security. And one thing that we have worked with them is certainly robocall prevention to block robocalls coming in. The tools that we offer are really kind of more focused on Canada and the US, but we definitely have some capabilities that are useful worldwide and in any network. They're not optimized, they're optimized for the US and Canada, but they can be useful for telecom fraud and for robocalls outside North America. And Aslo has helped us with customers that needed that. I think what's more interesting, or not more interesting, but let me, I think that, I've mentioned these private shaken networks because that is what we see. It's emerging. And, We've collaborated with Aslo for a long time, so I think they're kind of familiar with what I'm going to show in the next couple of slides. And Elena, let me move on to that if that's okay, yes. And then we'll answer more questions. Okay, so what's going to happen outside of North America? It's public shaken. It's going to be some time, probably. I don't know. It's going to be years, but there are things that federations of enterprises or carriers can do privately to agree, to cooperate, to protect their networks. And I'm going to go back to this slide. We talked about this out-of-band shaken slide. There's a lot going on here, but this is the key I wanted to focus on. This technology we are using in Canada and the US to send tokens to do shaken between networks that don't support shaken. And that's going to be the case in Mexico and every other country. The telephone service providers are not ready for shaken. Even if they have a SIP network, they probably will not pass the token. But that's okay. You can have a cloud verification service. Now, what is a cloud verification service? That's an organization that's probably, it could be a federation. It's a central entity with a group of operators. It's like we want to trust calls amongst ourselves. When we call each other across the telephone network, we can't trust the telephone calls because it goes across a non-secure network. I want to be able to make calls across the telephone network, but I want to be able to trust those. And that's what this cloud verification service does. It's a little bit, that first slide, you had the policy administrator, the governance authority, and the certificate authority. All that's collapsed into one entity. That is
what Aslo is doing, right?
That's I don't want to get ahead of what their plans are, but they would certainly have the expertise to do that sort of thing. I'm not sure where they are in terms of market announcements, but they definitely have the expertise to do that. Okay. And exactly. And the key, here's what you have here. You've got two enterprises, and these enterprises, they have office telephone systems, and you want to call another enterprise within your same corporation. and it's a sensitive telephone call. You don't want to have any potential fraud, robocall, telephone spoofing going on. But you don't want to build a new private telephone network. You want to use your existing telephone network, your existing SIP trunks, your existing, ISDN PRI trunks. You do that. You don't change anything in your telephone network, but you pass this token, passport token, out of band. So when it's received by the enterprise network, they can see this is the branch manager from this location in Monterey calling Mexico City or whatever it might be, because that digital token signed by this cloud verification service is passed to the destination. So that gives you the end-to-end trust that, for a federation of enterprises, or it could be a federation of service providers. But it's that out-of-band signaling that makes it possible today. There's the out-of-band signaling leverages IP networks. There's nothing new. There's no network upgrade. It uses existing infrastructure over the internet with your existing telephone infrastructure. So it's very powerful. Does everything a public shaken network would do without, having to wait on the regulators to define the trust. And this is where it gets a little more interesting. This is enterprise to enterprise, business facility to business facility. What you can do is you can give your subscribers an app. And I mean, so many enterprises already do this today. They give their subscribers an app on their phone and, for whatever purposes. But that app can receive that shaken passport out of band. And now when you call one of your subscribers, they will know if they have, the app from the banking company they use, or, the hospital they use, or whatever it might be. They will be able to see that rich call data. Who is calling, the logo, the reason for the call. All of that will show up just like it did in those earlier pictures. I showed you the T-Mobile example where they had their logo and call reason. It'll look just like that using an app that's provided by the cloud verification service, or it could be by the enterprise enabled by the cloud verification service. So anyway, that really can take, the trust network beyond enterprises to their customers. So I'll stop there, Elaine. I think that's just about everything I wanted to cover. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sorry. Does this cause any latency problem about all these certificates and validation? Affect the latency and the speed of the calls?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's just, we've never had anyone notice post-dial delay, not once. And I'll tell you, this out of band, this signaling across the IP network, across the public internet, is much faster than signaling through a telephone network. I mean, telephone networks, let's face it, I mean, they're slow compared to, a telephone switch is slow. We stream videos like this across the internet. You could never do that through a telephone network. So yeah, it's there's no impact on post-dial delay.
So do you think that this storage shaken framework is effective? We are watching probably in the news that despite of the recent reinforcement of this, people are still receiving spam calls.
Yes, that is true. And the reason that is true is because shaken is not implemented in the US and Canada. Well, it's not implemented in Canada yet. It will be in November. But in the US, it's not complete.
Started in June, right?
Pardon?
It started in June of this.
It started in June.
Mm-hmm.
It started in June, and it's not complete for two reasons. Small operators were given more time. if you have fewer than 100,000 subscribers, small operators are given more time to implement shaken. And shaken out of band, that technology standard was just approved in July. And when you have a TDM link in a telephone call, the shaken passport gets lost. So until you have shaken out of band implemented everywhere, you won't have shaken passports everywhere. And that's the problem. Until it really is everywhere, and it's happening quickly. I mean, it will be here, but until it's everywhere, you still have unlocked doors to the network where the bad people can make robocalls. So it's you're right. It's not done, but we are very feel very certain that when shaken is everywhere, the robocalls will be very few.
And in order to get that goal, enterprises of all sizes must be included in this framework, right?
Maybe.
Okay.
And the reason I say maybe because it's a model. They're different. We'll see how outside the U.S. and Canada, what does the market develop? Maybe there's some tiers, and so maybe not every enterprise is part of a verification cloud service, but maybe there's a tier to it. So, for example, if a telephone service provider joined a cloud verification service, then all those enterprises are now part of that trust network. The enterprises that are served by the telephone service provider, if that makes sense. So I don't know if I don't know if it's going to be every single enterprise joins the federation, or there's a tier, like service providers, or that kind of bring a lot of enterprises together in joining the private network. I guess the good thing is there's a lot of flexibility in how this can be implemented. And flexibilities can create complexity. I have so many choices, but that's good. There can be a solution for just about every arrangement, any kind of network design you can think of.
Well, that is amazing. I've learned so much, and I hope our audience too. And where can people can find you, your website, your LinkedIn? Please tell us every detail of you.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
not all the details, but
yeah. So our website, I guess you can maybe have that here. Here it is. So our website is transnexus.com. And we have for the technical people, if there are some on this call, we've got all the standards here. You can go to this link here to get all the standards if there are any implementers that are want to know that information. And regarding the robocall mitigation, it's pretty simple. If you just send me an email at jim.dalton.com, I'll point you to where to go at the FCC to file your robocall mitigation plan. And like I say, it's there have been many non-U.S. carriers that have submitted their plan. You can see what others have done. It's transparent, and I'm happy to help you with that. It won't be much work.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can. Well, thank you so much for telling us all this very important information. Let's see, probably in 6 months, let's talk again and see how it's developing and how all everything is growing in US and in Canada. I hope that everything goes well, and I'll make an invitation for our audience to remain with us at 1 p.m. Time, Mexico City time. We're going to start. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll start at 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. U.S. time. Jim, thank you so much for being with us, and I don't know. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Elena. Enjoyed it.
Cada llamada representa oportunidad y riesgo. El teléfono tiene mucho que decir, más allá de los dígitos que presenta. VoiceEck Cloud analiza en tiempo real los números que llaman a tu empresa, utilizando algoritmos que combinan más de 10 criterios de seguridad para identificar llamadas con riesgo de fraude, extorsión, robo de identidad y otras amenazas, haciendo que tu negocio sea productivo, de una manera segura. VoiceEck Cloud, telefonía inteligente, tu negocio, seguro.
Ok, están realizando una compra con cargo a su tarjeta débito. ¿Usted está realizando esta compra, señor?
Cuando recibes una llamada y dicen que son de tu banco, pero te piden algún dato como tu contraseña o NIP, ojo, puede tratarse de un delincuente. Más de 1.900.000 fraudes se realizaron tan solo en el primer trimestre del 2021. 13.560 casos de robo de identidad en ese mismo periodo. De 4.6 millones de extorsiones denunciadas, 88.9% de ellas fueron a través de extorsiones telefónicas. No te pierdas la Semana de la Seguridad Telefónica presentada por Aslo Information Technologies. 19 y 20 de octubre. Acceso libre a las pláticas con expertos y expertas en los sectores legal, tecnológico, de negocios y humano. Dale like y conéctate a cada charla en facebook.com/Aslo Infotech. Te esperamos.